I was introduced as a software expert, and sadly I have to tell you, nothing is further from the truth. My expertise really is that I've spent the last 15 years in football, particularly English football, and was responsible for building this stadium, Wembley Stadium. And therefore a lot of the experience and knowledge that I've gained from that has gone into the software that I will be describing today. However, what I'm actually going to do, because it's very hard to demonstrate software, even if I had it live in real time. It's a very difficult concept, I think. What I'm actually going to do is tell you what's condensed in the software and what it's aiming to deliver. And that's a story of English football over the last 30 years. So we're going to talk about the commercial success which English football is today, but go back to the problems in the 1980s, how those problems were overcome, and talk about how it can be sustained. As you know, the Premier League and English football in general is broadcast all over the world, and we have stadiums such as this one. This is the Emirates, which really look great on television. They're full. They look really exciting, vibrant places. As I was talking about, this is Wembley when it's full. I worked on this with Greg's colleagues in Populous. It really is a very, very big stadium, and in many ways created the problem that we had as to how are you going to manage this. There's 5 miles of concourses in order to manage operationally, and of course the answer is in a very organized and planned way. So some of the things that you can see when you look at these stadia particularly are there's no perimeter or segregation fencing as we used to have, as some people still have. This is my team. Sole reason I threw this one in. This is Sunderland's ground, the Stadium of Light. It's about 15 years old, and you'll see here that there's no perimeter fencing. It's all very open. In England, we love to be close to the pitch, close to the action, and this is what gives the matches a lot of the atmosphere that we're after. But as I say, it wasn't always like that. There were deep, dark times. In the 1980s, football was really a very negative sport, got a lot of bad publicity, there was a lot of violence, there were old crumbling stadia, nobody had invested in them for ages, and the crowds were falling. It was only going one way. In order to try and solve these problems, what we now know is that actually we went in the wrong direction. Pitch-side fences were introduced to cage these wild fans. Fences were installed to segregate fans, keep them away from each other, and more police came in to have tighter control over the stadia. And then disaster struck, not once but several times. This awful photograph is from the Bradford fire in 1985, when 56 people were killed in a fire. And it could have been avoided, but there weren't any fire extinguishers in the stadium or in that particular stand. And the reason why was that they thought that fans would throw them at each other and become missiles. So it was part of the bad behavior was part of the problem. In 1989, at an FA Cup semi-final at Hillsborough, there was a terrible crush with too many people getting into too small a part of the stadium. 96 people were killed. It was just out of control. And at that point, everybody said enough is enough. And having had all of the initiatives around fencing people, policing people, actually it was time for a longer think about this so that people could say, look, where is this going? How are we going to sort this out? And it was the government that had to take the lead, and out of that review, lots of recommendations came out. I won't go through them in detail, but there were some very interesting things. So, for example, here, crowds to be controlled by stewards, not the police. Stewards to be trained to a national standard. All the requirements in terms of how to operate a stadium were written into a document. It's about 230 pages long, called the Green Guide, and so on. So suddenly it was going to be different. We were going to stop policing these stadia very hard. There was also going to be investment in upgrading stadia, and actually a lot of clubs decided it was time to build a new stadium. This is the external view of the Emirates, and it's a good example of when people move to the new stadia, actually suddenly all their revenue started to increase and go through the roof. So what was an answer to a problem suddenly became a nice solution and something that everybody was happy with. And in doing that at the new stadia, suddenly you had new sources of revenue. So on here you had concerts. This is obviously hospitality, and of course now you start to get digital offerings and all those things that our marketing and commercial friends get very excited about and are very good at delivering. But what that's kind of missing is the basics. You're not actually going to get all those additional sources of revenue unless you sort out the base product. So if somebody's going to spend, they need to be engaged. And if they're going to be engaged, they need to be having a comfortable experience. And if they're going to be comfortable, they need to feel safe and secure. So you begin to realize what the priorities are. In terms of commercial success, safety and security is not optional. It's absolutely fundamental. As I've described, the success that's been achieved in the UK, and England in particular, has been achieved over 25 years. But actually, don't get too disappointed, because the good news is it can be replicated anywhere at any time. You know, there's a lot of learning there. You don't need to reinvent what happened. You can just copy it. And in fact, many countries now are adopting the Green Guide because it's the one guide out there, and it's becoming somewhat of a global standard. And this is the document. I don't want to go through the 230 pages, but it does start to kind of break down the management of a stadium into the physical condition to make sure that physically the stadium has what it needs in order to run it, and also in terms of the management and the people and the competence of those who are going to put on the events. Also, it's very prescriptive. I have to say, when I took charge of Wembley and the prospect of all this health and safety didn't really fill me with a lot of excitement. But when you start to read the document, and congratulations to whoever did it, it's a very dry type of subject. But when you read it, it makes a lot of sense. It's not intimidating in terms of the detail or the technical aspects. And you start to look at it and say, well, actually, I understand this. And what they've done is they've condensed what is essentially common sense into a document that people can follow and to read. It's yes, it's a lot of it is about how you design new stadia, but also it's very valid and has to be very appropriate for existing stadia. So it's not just about building stadiums, it's about how you operate stadiums and how you make the best use of what you have. And of course, when the commercial people within your organization are trying to maximize revenue in the stadium, you have to do it in a way that fits operationally. And often there's a conflict in those areas, and it helps you to resolve those conflicts. The big thing really is that there has been such a move away from police managing the stadia. Yes, of course, the police are involved. Yes, there's a lot of liaison with the police, and the police actually gather a lot of intelligence before events, which can be fed into the people managing the stadium. But now there is a safety officer. He is responsible for the event, and it's very important to have somebody, one person responsible that you can absolutely crystallize the whole operation on, not kind of people pointing at each other saying, no, that's your role, that's your role. So everyone is supporting the safety officer, but he and his team, importantly, are customer-facing. They're helping the consumers to have an enjoyable experience. They're not policing them. And I think what's happened is that in the past, we treat football supporters like animals, and surprise, surprise, maybe they behave like them sometimes. Whereas treat people nicely, surprise, surprise, they behave nicely. And therefore, well, that's all very well and it sounds great, but what does that mean, and how do you do it? And the answer is, actually, I guess like any activity, if you're wanting to make sure it goes well on the day, you have a very long checklist that you have to go through to make sure that every one of your assets, all the equipment you're going to use is up to date, it's maintained, it's serviced, it's in place, and it's going to work when you need it. In terms of all the people, you've got all the roles that you need, they're trained properly, and they're going to be able to be counted on the day. And essentially what Stadium Management Systems, my company, have done is to condense all of these procedures, these checks, this management process into a piece of software, because at the moment, actually, it's in 1 million pieces of paper. Those checklists are all paper-based. I remember at Wembley looking at my stadium director and saying, you know, are we compliant? And he smiled and said yes. And typically I said to him, how do I know that? And he just smiled and he said, look, there's all those files over there full of paper. If you want to go through them all to check, then you can. And I just smiled back and said, so I've got to trust you, do I? That's okay, but it's not good enough. What you need to know is you need to have transparency, and you need to be able to know that everything is in order before you open those doors and you have the event. So the software provides an integrated management system for stadium operators. It is a pre-event planning tool. It helps to plan the resources and actually to create more efficiency. Actually, it was very useful to have Greg showing all these changes in transformation of stadium, going from one type of event to another type of event, because what it actually shows is that managers of stadia don't just plan for one type of event. They plan for different types of events. And our software can help them do that very easily. But even if it's just a football stadium and all they ever have is a football match, well, you know what? There are small football matches and big football matches. There are going to be a small crowd, a big crowd. There are going to be matches which are sensitive because it's against a local rival. There are matches which are not so sensitive. So all of these actually should have a different operating plan. And this is all the pre-match thinking which allows stadiums to operate far more efficiently and effectively. So I won't go through all of these. That's an important point. You have a man who's operating the stadium, but then you have people above him, whether it's the board of directors or the local authority or whoever is also responsible. And software like this allows much easier review and audit. It creates a similar format that everybody's going to follow, and therefore it's easier to know that these people are doing their job properly, comprehensively, and also it's for the stadium operators to show that, to demonstrate they're doing that, and it helps them in their job. It also helps where specific risks are identified ahead of the event, and you can feed them into the software to make sure that the plan covers the operating procedures to cover those off. It certainly helps with staff training, because now you can do it from a desktop position rather than having to do it in the stadium itself or in concept. And actually a very big advantage is that you'll see when I run through the software what we've actually loaded up, or what can be loaded up in any market, is the relevant regulation and legislation that a stadium operator has to comply with. Now, actually it's vast, and sometimes you wonder how a stadium operator can know all of that. In the UK, and I couldn't possibly go through all the different types, but there's the Green Guide I've talked about, the Safety at Sports Ground Act, Health and Safety, Fire Regulations, and on and on. And this poor guy in charge, who you begin to get sympathy for when you realize the things that they're trying to coordinate within the stadium, has to make sure that everything he does is compliant with those laws. So out of it, I think you're getting the gist now. There's greater transparency across the business, and with working with external emergency services, for example. You really should be able to reduce costs an awful lot, because now you're looking at exactly how many people you need to operate the stadium in a compliant manner. And then above that, you probably will employ more people to run the stadium, but they're actually for customer service reasons. They're to make sure people have a comfortable time. That's discretionary. That's the conversation that you can have with your own management and within your own company. And actually, now you can quantify risk, you can show what the risks are, how you're dealing with them, and it's just possible. I'm not guaranteeing this one, but it's just possible if you go and talk to your insurer and show that you can quantify the risks involved and that you've mitigated them, that your insurance premiums might be lower. So, what does the software have? Well, the first thing, of course, it has to have is the stadium or the venue itself. It then has a library of all the regulations and legislation that can be referred to by the stadium operator. And also, that's the point where you can feed in risks which need to be managed. Then there's the assets, basically the equipment that you're using to manage, whether that's fire extinguishers, CCTVs, electrical equipment, and so on. And then the roles in the organization, described with their responsibilities, the accreditation those people need, the qualifications, and also the people that you employ. That all then comes out. Remember, we talked before about the safety management factor and the physical condition of the stadium. You can quantify those, and in the way the Green Guide works, that determines how many people you can have in your stadium safely and becomes the thing that the operator focuses on. Also on the day itself, because it's a dynamic event, you can track the incidents that happen in a call logger and in a sense becomes the loop where that gets fed back into this whole management. So that's a document library, no need to dwell on that, but these are all relevant documents from the UK and from UEFA and FIFA, and it just shows you that there's an awful lot of bedtime reading in there. How the software works, as you saw from that template, it takes the stadium itself. Let's say you take the architect's drawings, you feed it in there, and then you plan stand by stand, floor by floor, room by room. So if we go down to one of the actual floors, you can see here that these people are all deployed. These are pitchside stewards. These are people on the gangways. Behind there, you've got rooms. And this just demonstrates the pre-thinking that it is required. So in some of the rooms, and apologies, it's difficult to see, but you'll see they're bounded with red. Red will mean that maybe it's an equipment room with electrical plants, so it's dangerous and people need to be aware that there are such dangers in those rooms. Others will be fine and they'll be green, or they might be amber. And likewise, the people themselves, every role will be categorized as to what role they have in which particular circumstance. Now, I'll come on to that. Up here, you can't see it, but this plan is for a medium-sized football match, or sorry, medium-risk football match. There would be more people in if it was a high-risk football match, and of course less if it wasn't. Also, what we can do is to plan. So the previous slide was in normal operation mode. This is for a contingency. So there is an incident, it needs to be tackled, and you'll see some of the people here have actually turned orange. Why? They're the people who've been pre-designated of coping with incidents as they happen. You can see here as well that you start to get some details. If you hover over any one of these, click on it, you get the detail of who that person is, what the qualifications are, and so on. Now, this is in evacuation mode, so you'll see there are far less people because anyone who isn't classified as an evacuation steward has gone. They're at the muster points, which are outside here, and the red stewards are left to handle with the evacuation. So you can already see this pre-thinking, pre-planning, and everything coming into action on the match day. Just to run through how it physically happens, there's an investment in time at the beginning when you first get the software, and you have to load all of the assets and the roles, and you have to categorize them as I was describing. Obviously, these are fire extinguishers, fire hose reels. And again, you've got perfect detail behind because it'll describe what the product is, who the manufacturer is, when it was last checked, maintained, etc. And of course, throughout the building, there are lots of fire extinguishers. And in your pre-event checks, what you're doing with your team is to go through and make sure that they're all in place, they're up to date, etc. So you see over here, one has been checked, that's gone green. Up here, on firefighting equipment, the red bar has started to go from red to green, so you're starting to see that you're becoming compliant and you're working towards that P and S factor calculation. This is a description of a role. So again, you can go through it in detail in terms of what this person does. Of course, many organizations have role descriptions, but it's just making sure that everybody does have one, they clearly know what it is, and it fits in with the overall operation. And you'll see that this little person over here is red, so he's clearly one of those people. In fact, he's the safety officer himself, so he's very responsible and will deal with evacuations. Again, coming back to the dashboard effect, this is where you're checking that the people that you've got are in the plan, and when they start to be in place, then the red bars go to green. And then you aggregate all the bars, the dashboards, and it starts to give you the calculation you need, which is here, which is overall, you're nearly there, but you're not quite ready for the event. On here, you've got the physical factor, and you've got the management factor as well. So that really is too quick a run through it, and I apologize again, but it's trying to give you a feeling for the fact that all stadia can be really planned and organized in a very manageable, very successful way. At the moment, it's paper processes and difficult, really, to get a handle on it, and to some extent feels like a dark art. What we're trying to do is to turn it into a science. All of this pre-planning, and again, coming back to the Greg presentation, what you can actually do is you can put a design for a stadium into the software, and you can start to create management plans around it. And you can go back to Greg and his architect colleagues and say, operationally, this doesn't quite work here, or it's going to need a lot of stewarding. Can you move that? And so on. So the transparency and the pre-thinking about the stadium in design mode or each event before it happens is actually worth literally millions and millions of dollars, because that's the expense you'll have in the long term. So that was it. I apologize for the speed of this story, but I hope it was worth it. Thank you.